next paper, which is by Eyub Yegen, will be presented by Eyub, and it's called Investing in Influence, Investors, Portfolio Firms and Political Giving. And the discussant is going to be Mike Klausner, who is in the right time zone to discuss this. But first we hear from you, Eyub. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you for having us on the program. Thank you to the organizers. And so this is joint work with Marianne Bertrand and Matilda Bombardini from Berkeley, Ray Fisman from Boston, and then Francesca Trevi from Berkeley. And we have been working on this topic for a while, and what we are interested in is that so there are these protected limits to political contributions in the United States and in other countries around the world. And what these limits to contributions are after is that they aim to, let's say, reduce the potential for corruption in politics by, let's say, allowing certain very powerful and resourceful individual and entities to, let's say, have access to certain politicians, let's say, through supporting them with political contributions or so. So there's usually a cap that is being put in place. But then we also know that as long as there are these caps, there are also potentials, or like individuals have been looking for potentials to get around them in legal ways. And some of the good examples is that there was actually a Supreme Court holding in the sense that actually allowed, let's say, to lift some of these limits to, let's say, politicians' contributions, let's say, through these super PACs and so on and so forth. So there were some changes on this aspect. And there are also different channels, not just necessarily through these political action committee contributions, but let's say there's also like bundling activities or lobbying, or in some of my co-authors' prior work, they also show that, let's say, philanthropic giving is potentially used as a mechanism to influence politicians. But what we are really after in this paper is that we want to look into a distinct channel that hasn't been previously studied, and that's going to be of particular interest to individuals in finance and also in corporate governance. And what we are after is that we want to look into the equity ownership of corporations. So let's say look into institutional investors, and whether when you have, let's say, a large stake in a corporation, can you actually make use of this economic ownership and translate into political influence? So that's really the core of the paper that we're after. And it has already been brought up on this. So there was some discussion on, I would say, by asset managers on this aspect. So what, let's say, North Star has been very vocal on this. It's an asset management company. And what they have said is that they should be actually allowed to step in and, let's say, shape the contributions. So, for example, one of its portfolio firms, Intel, and they should be actually allowed to, let's say, have a saying on these aspects. Typically, when we look into political action committee contributions, it's meant to be actually, so it's not a, let's say, a support or like, let's say, a contribution the corporation is doing. It's actually the employees of the corporation that, let's say, contribute to this, this fund. And then that fund is actually being redistributed to politicians. So it's not directly coming from the corporation itself. That's an important point to make. But even irrespective of that, these asset management companies actually have been saying that they should have a saying in terms of, let's say, what these corporations should be doing, irrespective of the fact that it's really the employees that have the last saying on what to do with, let's say, these political contributions. It shouldn't be really it's not coming from the corporation's funds itself directly, it's coming from the employees. But what's really after, what I would say, like why these asset management companies have been vocal is that we have, let's say, these potential issues that managers may be also influencing how these political action committee contributions are being, let's say, redistributed. And let's say there are, I would say the most prevalent example is that there are these social investors that are, let's say, against these anti-LGBTQ, let's say, supports to legislators. Or like let's say these legislators that have an anti-LGBTQ agenda, they actually may be supported by, let's say, Intel or so. So in that aspect, the social investor may actually be worried about this because it can have an impact on, let's say, on their images now. So in that aspect, it's a fair point that these asset management companies have making in terms of, let's say, constraining these managerial political prerequisites that are, let's say, not necessarily benefiting the corporation, but are really just about the managers' preferences, political preferences. So in that aspect, that could be actually something maybe potentially good. But I would be a bit worried is that there may be also these potential cases where you have, let's say, some certain asset management companies stepping in, and they actually maybe, let's say, having a great influence of the corporations and actually shape the political contributions in their favor. Not just necessarily in the favor of the overall shareholder base, but just like they want to reflect their own, let's say, political preferences or let's say their ideologies or so. So in that aspect, there may be a trade-off between or trading between these managerial prerequisites and then with the owner's political prerequisites. So we have this issue of political misgovernance issue being traded with one another. So what do we find in this paper? So we're really going after this after these, I would say, like these tests. And what we wanted to do first is that we look into these very first time acquisitions in a public company by an asset manager. So very first time. So let's say, think about, let's say Citadel going in and buying a stake in Apple for the very first time. We look into if that acquisition was larger than 1%. If it was larger than 1%, it would enter a sample, and we would be looking into how, let's say, the correlation between political givings changes in the post period versus the pre-period. And what we see is that there's actually about a fourfolding of of the correlations in giving in the post period. And then we claim that this relationship is causal. We add a very large set of two fixed effects, and we still find that the results are robust to these inclusions of fixed effects. And then also we look into these passively acquired acquisitions, so these passive stock acquisitions, and we find that the results are even stronger actually. And then to explain why we find actually there's a let's say an increase in the correlation of these political alignments, but we look into is we want to pin down if the firm is adopting to the investors' political preferences or if it's the other way around. So what we do is that we look into these persistencies of givings over time, and we find that the investors are actually quite sticky in their givings, so they don't change very much their political donations. But we actually find that the firms are quite like they're actually very much changing their political givings, and that could potentially help us out in terms of identifying that who's changing more or who's adopting more towards, let's say, one set of the investor or the firm. And then we also find that the results are stronger for these political and partisan investors and the ones that are actually privately held. And we again go to the point and make a point and say that this is best explained by the fact that these privately held, especially investors, so think about Citadel, it's much easier for, let's say, Kenneth Griffin to reflect his own personal views on the asset management company's decisions and, let's say, reflect that in the influence of the asset management company on these, let's say, equity firms versus, let's say, BlackRock. It's very difficult that Larry Fink would, let's say, or let's say the owners of BlackRock, it's a publicly traded company, that they would be reflecting, let's say, their own personal views on, let's say, the influence that BlackRock is making. So in that aspect, we find actually the results are much stronger in cases like, let's say, Citadel, where it's a privately held fund, it's a partisan fund, versus, let's say, BlackRock, which is a publicly traded company, and it is sometimes partisan. It does have a, let's say, political activity, but it's not very much active as, let's say, Citadel itself. And then to explain how, let's say, these asset management companies are influencing these portfolio firms, we also look into board connections, and we find actually that board membership or board representation of, let's say, Citadel or another, let's say, asset management company on the portfolio firm is actually a good predictor of this increase in the convergence. So to just give an overview of what I will be talking about, or what data we use, so we will be having two types of analyses, and one is going to be at the firm investor pair, congressional cycle and congressional district level. So this is going to be the regression test, and then we will also have these cosine similarity scores, where we will collapse it to the cycle level, and it's going to be a cosine score for the firm, investor, and the cycle. So how, let's say, similar they are in terms of giving overall, let's say, in that given cycle. And then the starting time is going to be in 1980 until 2016. The ownership data starts in 1980. We will be including all of the 13F investors. So these are the large asset management companies that they disclose their equity ownership positions. And then we will be including all of the portfolio firms of these investors. And then what we do next is that, so this was quite cumbersome to do. This was manual work we did. We linked the Thomson Reuters data with the PEC ownership data. So we had quite a bit of RA work in this area. And then we checked quite many times, actually, if everything was robust. And we followed the approach of Marianne's and the other co-authors AER paper that was recently published. And then we distinguish between two types of acquisitions. So first is going to be these very first acquisitions that will include all of the acquisitions. So it doesn't necessarily mean these are index-driven acquisitions. And we will have a 1% of ownership threshold. We will have different thresholds as well. We have checked those things, and it's not necessarily driving our results, but the inclusion requirement, as I will be explaining in a bit, is going to be 1% of ownership. And then we also will be looking to these index-driven acquisitions. So very first time additional to, let's say, the S&P 500. So the analysis is going to be all of the investor firm pairs are going to be included if, let's say, they satisfy the condition that there was a zero ownership at the let's say, at the start of the sample, or let's say at the, not necessarily the start of the sample, but let's say Citadel didn't have any ownership in Apple in 2000, and then they started actually buying 1% of the outstanding shares in a given single 13th quarter. And then we will be including that in analyzing, let's say, how let's say Citadel and Apple's, let's say, political alignment is, let's say, changing in the post period up until Citadel actually divest from Apple itself. And then, so we will be having the ownership correlation sample, as I mentioned before, and the cosine similarity scores, which I will also talk in a bit about. So the ownership correlations analysis, the main variables will be the investors' pack givings and also the firm's pack givings. So these will be at the firm or investor, congressional district, and congressional cycle, and also the time level. And then we will be looking to the log of 1+ firm or investor pack givings. That's going to be what we will be after, and looking into these post interactions, if that actually explains, let's say, the increase in convergencies. And then the cosine similarity scores, we will have 3 different measures. One measure is going to be to look into these investor firm similarities that's within a given cycle. And what we will do is that it's pretty much just the dot product of the vector of investor givings and the dot product with the dot product of the vector of the firm givings, and then that's scaled by the length of these vectors. So it's, in essence, it's similar to a correlation, but it will give us a score between 0 and 1 in terms of how similar they are, let's say, in the given cycle. And then we also look into the across time changes for the investor and the firm individually, and that will help us out in terms of thinking who changes more its political giving over time. And this is going to help us out in terms of understanding who adopts to who's giving. So before I share with you the first, I would say the main result of the paper, so the specification that we follow is that it's going to be a log transformation of 1+ firm pack contributions. And then similarly, we will regress that on the interaction between log 1+ investor giving. And here the main variable of interest is going to be the interaction term. And so post is, or the binary variable post is going to take the value of 1 in the periods where let's say Citadel has acquired at least 1% of ownership in a given firm. Pre-period is 0, or like post-period is going to take the value 0 in the pre-period, and that's like when Citadel doesn't have any ownership at all. And then we will be including a large set of fixed effects. And what we're really after here is that we will be adding, let's say, firm or the interaction of firm, investor, cycle, and district fixed effects. And we actually find that the results are robust across very strict, especially I would say the last column is very strict in terms of its specification. And we find actually that the results are robust to these type of, let's say, inclusions of two-way fixed effects. And relative to the level effect, we actually find that there's a large jump in terms of the correlations. Goes up to about 375% of an increase in the correlations. So a good, I would say that some of the interpretation of these fixed effects is that, so let's say cycle times district fixed effects would capture, let's say, a popularity of a politician in a given cycle. So think about, let's say, Nancy Pelosi. If she's very popular during a cycle, she actually might be, let's say, getting more money from both the investor and the portfolio firm, and that might just explain the correlation. So to rule out these type of, let's say, effects, we actually include, let's say, a very strict set of fixed effects, and the results are actually surprisingly robust across these fixed effects. And then, but then, of course, the concern here is that we haven't really ruled out the potential that, let's say, Citadel is a Republican asset management company, and they may be, let's say, self-selecting into also like, let's say, Republican portfolio firms. So there might be this endogenous selection of asset management companies into, let's say, similarly, let's say similar companies that have a similar ideology in terms of its political preferences, and then maybe explaining these low-moving convergencies in givings. And to rule that out, what we will be doing is that we will look into the very first time addition of, let's say, a portfolio, or like, let's say, a firm into an index. And then we look into whether, let's say, the asset management company that tracks the index will be, let's say, seeing a similarity in its convergence. So this really helps us out with this potential endogeneity concern of asset management companies self-selecting into these portfolio firms. And what we find here is that we actually find that the results are still robust, and we follow the same specification as before. And we actually find that the relative magnitude, so the interaction term compared to, let's say, the level effect, is actually quite large. So it's like much larger than the main effect itself. We think that the reason why we find cleaner estimations or stronger estimations here is due to the fact that, let's say, if you think about a self-selection story, that maybe, let's say, if you already self-select into let's say a publicly traded company, you will be not, let's say, seeing a large jump in the let's say the convergence, because you are already very politically, let's say, aligned with that given portfolio firm. But here, let's say you have the opportunity to influence a portfolio firm, and you didn't really choose it necessarily yourself. You actually maybe then make use of this opportunity to, let's say, exploit your equity ownership to translate that into political or like an amplification of political influence. And then we also do this with like event plots, and these are the coefficients over time. And we actually find that for especially the index-driven acquisitions, it's very stable after the second cycle. So these are congressional cycles. And we also do this with the cosine similarity scores, and we also find similar results here. So there's this, they're not very similar, it's very sticky. And then we actually find that there's this jump, and then it becomes again quite stable after that. And then what we do next is that, so far I have just shared with you the fact that there is a potential increase in, let's say, these convergencies and the political alignment between the portfolio firm and the investors, but we don't know what type of investors, let's say, are engaging in these activities. And so what we will be doing is that we will look into the, let's say, breakdown between public versus privately held institutional investors. So here the idea that we have is that if, let's say, the asset management company is privately held, it's much easier that the owners, or let's say the managers of these corporations, that they reflect their own ideologies on the, say, the influence of these funds. So for BlackRock or Fidelity or State Street, it's going to be much more difficult for, let's say, the owners or individual owners to reflect their own ideologies versus, let's say, a Citadel or Paloma funds. They are actually a lot easier. So let's say the owners or the managers may be, let's say, much more easy able to, let's say, reflect their ideologies on the influence of these, let's say, asset management companies' decisions. So in that aspect, we expect that this test could help us out in terms of, let's say, pinning down, is this a story about, let's say, personal preferences of asset management companies, or is this, let's say, a strategic gain story where these asset management companies are better at, let's say, identifying these political givings, and they actually maybe, let's say, shaping the political givings of these portfolio firms just to benefit the overall, let's say, financial decisions of these corporations. So this is going to help us out in terms of at least getting close to it. We're not going to say that we rule out the fact that there may be still some financial gains on it, but it at least helps us out in terms of coming back to closer to a story about, is this about a consumption goods story, or is it about financial gain story? And then we also will go further and look into political funds. So these are the ones that are very active in terms of political giving, and then partisanship. So we will be looking into these skewness or above median skewness in terms of, let's say, giving to either the Republican Party or the Democratic or the Democratic Party. So it's going to be either left wing or right wing in terms of its giving. And what we find is that we actually document that the results are primarily driven by these privately held funds. So the results are, let's say, driven by the Citadels of the world or Paloma funds of the world versus, let's say, the BlackRocks or the State Street of the world. And then we also find that the results are, it's much stronger if you look into, let's say, these political funds. And if you break it even down further, the partisan ones actually seem to be driving the results quite a lot. So this all suggests that it's potentially about personal preferences of the asset management company story, rather than, let's say, asset management companies trying to shape the political givings of these portfolio firms just for, let's say, to increase the overall returns of the benefits of, let's say, these political contributions. Otherwise, we'll be finding results irrespective of, let's say, partisanship or, let's say, privately held versus publicly traded asset management companies. And then, so I've just shared with you so far that We find evidence that there is an increase in correlations of these givings. It's potentially causal. We know that it's potentially driven because of a personal preference story. It's driven by these privately held and partisan funds. But how do they do that? How do they engage with, let's say, the portfolio firms? That's always I would say, a mysterious, it's a black box in this in institutional ownership type of, let's say, governance stories. So what we wanted to do is that we wanted to look into board membership. We thought this could be a really nice way of looking into this. And what we looked into is, so this was, again, manual work. We had to link the asset management companies with BoardX data. And what we do is that, what we find is that, that there is indeed going to be, I can share the results here, that when there's a board connection, so let's say when Citadel sits on the board of a portfolio firm, there's actually an increase in the, I would say, the amplification of these convergencies, suggesting that board membership may be an important mechanism in which asset management companies are able to, let's say, influence portfolio firms' decisions. And then it's still unclear whether, let's say, the firm adopts to the investors or the investor adopts to the firm. I have been so far pitching this as if the firms are adopting to the investors' decisions, but of course we need to do this also statistically. And what we have done is that we looked into these cosine similarity scores, and we first looked into the within investors giving similarities across time, and compare that to the firms' givings across time. So how similar are, let's say, Apple's givings over time versus, let's say, Citadel's givings over time. And this, if, let's say, Citadel has a high cosine similarity scores, that would suggest that, let's say, the asset management company is actually very sticky in its giving, versus compared to, let's say, the firms or the portfolio firms' givings itself. And then we also do this like using different measures. And what we find is that the very first row suggests that these institutional investor givings, political givings, are actually very sticky. They're about 75% of the time very similar across time, and then also for the firms it's actually about 55%. So it's about a 20% of a difference of stickiness, I would say, suggesting that it's or if you look into different, let's say, measures, we have looked at two different, let's say, we use, let's say, 2 cycles in between, and we find similar results here. And this would suggest that it's most likely, or results are most likely explained by the fact that asset management these firms are actually adopting to the givings of these asset management companies rather than the other way around, where, let's say, asset management companies may be adopting to the firm's givings. Oh, perfect. Okay, finally. So to just wrap it up, so what we find in this paper is that there is indeed evidence that suggests that there may be an increase in cosine similarity, or like these similarities of political givings between institutional investors and the portfolio firms give political givings. And we argue that this relationship, or the increase in similarity, is best explained by looking into who changes more in terms of its givings. And it's really driven by the fact that asset management companies may be potentially influencing these portfolio firms, and portfolio firms are actually adopting more to the investors' givings. And to look into the potential mechanism in order to understand how asset management companies, in particular the privately held ones and these politically active investors that seem to be driving the results, maybe actually influencing portfolio firms. We looked into board connections, and we find actually that board membership of, let's say, or board representation of an asset management company on the board of, let's say, the portfolio firm is actually a potential good economic channel in order to understand how this influence is exerted into, let's say, real life decision-making processes. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to the discussion, and perfect.
Great, thank you very much, Eyub. So, Mike, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you, Eyub. You've actually rendered some of my comments now either irrelevant or superfluous, because you've answered some of the questions that I had. But maybe it would help if I emphasize some of that. So, basic point is, when an institution invests, it apparently influences political spending. When it takes a board seat, it's got more influence. And your measure of political spending is political action committee spending. The comment I just wrote in just now is that it struck me, and it didn't really strike me as I'm reading the paper, but as you're speaking, it would be really useful to have a sense of the intuition, an intuitive sense of the magnitudes. I'm not even sure how I can express an intuition about the magnitudes, but intuitively, we want to know, is Citadel having a really big effect or a really little effect, and compared to what? That's one thought that just struck me as you were speaking. So I'm a lawyer, though I'm not a election lawyer. I educated myself a little bit, and I thought the most useful thing I could do would be to provide a little bit of legal commentary. So here's the legal context. How can a corporation make a political contribution? There are a few ways. First, it can make a direct expenditure on TV ads or anything else, its own spending, and that's unlimited, and it can use corporate funds for that. That's not what you're talking about, I know, but I'm trying to put what you're talking about into context. The other thing the corporation can do is to give to an independent political spending entity called a super PAC that cannot be closely tied to a party or a candidate, though I think that's honored in the breach. The corporation can use an unlimited amount of its own spending for that. The third thing it can do, which is what you're talking about, is it can form a corporate PAC and have the PAC give to candidates, a political action committee. You did mention this, but I think it's really important, is that the corporation's funds aren't used to fund the PAC. Employees and managers' cash is used for that. And it's limited. An individual can give up to $5,000 per person per year, and then the PAC can give $5,000 per candidate per election. So this is very limited. You might say limited or not limited, why are they allowed to do this? And actually what I should say is that what I'm about to say is probably more related to is more related to the other sorts of political expenditures. But you might say, why on earth are they allowed to do this to begin with? And I don't know whether the US is unique in this respect. I certainly hope it is for the good of other countries. But the Supreme Court about 10 years ago in a case called Citizens United said that this was free speech. And Ron Gilson and I wrote an op-ed in Forbes that said that the Supreme Court clearly and explicitly misunderstood corporate governance when he talked about this as speech. You know, not to go into too much detail about that, is what the Supreme Court said in its infinite wisdom was that if the shareholders of a corporation don't like the political spending of of management, they can vote out the board. That's not a very interesting or intelligent statement, but let's move on. So the political context, it turned out that the Citizens United case, which was a big worry, at least so far hasn't amounted to that much, well, it hasn't had that much of an impact on public corporations. Public corporations spend very little. Their PACs spend little. The biggest PAC is AT&T's PAC, which is $2.7 million. Average congressional campaign costs $1 million, and there are 435 House elections. So the PAC spending isn't going to amount to much. The direct expenditures turn out to be very rare. This was a big concern about Citizens United. This is not current data and the sources I cite down there, but there were 10 corporations that engaged in, 10 public corporations that engaged in direct expenditures. That's their own TV ads for Trump or whoever. And that number, incidentally, is pre-Trump election, I believe. And then donations to super PACs by public corporations also are very low. So Citizens United hasn't turned out to be a big influence on public company spending so far, and PAC spending itself is fairly small. So we're talking about arguably a small amount of influence here on elections, though I suppose there could be individual circumstances where where that is important. But nonetheless, let's go to your findings, which I thought were very interesting. Board influencing PAC spending is not surprising, as you suggested. Boards make decisions for corporations. They can have influence over who is, what managers are responsible for the PAC spending, I assume. I believe a board member can give money to a PAC. I'm not positive about that. I'm fairly sure. Now your 1% shareholder influence, that's really surprising. I mean, I'm totally shocked by that. I'd love to understand how it works. And that's just going to lead me to some questions that I'm going to ask you. I don't have answers to these, so I'll just ask them. So who of these investors are the ones that are interested in a PAC's political spending? Is it the Vanguard CEO? Is it somebody else at Vanguard? It would be interesting, and I know this is not the style of economist papers, but it'd be interesting just anecdotally to just find out how this works. If nothing else, just as a matter of your future conversations. And why do they care? Because the stakes per portfolio company are going to be very low. The company can only spend $5,000 on a candidate, on a congressional candidate. Which leads to the second question, and that is, what funds are driving the results? You went a long ways, and you explained it well just in the paper and in the talk. I think I picked up on it a little bit better in your talk. So these are private funds that have most of the influence, that have an outside influence, and politically oriented funds, or funds with politically oriented people in them, have more influence. I'm curious, how many are they? I'm curious who they are. Is there something special about them? Again, it's really the context underlying the statistics that would be very useful to understand better. And I think in the paper, I believe you say that the public funds still have some influence, which is surprising, as you said in your talk. And I'm just curious, what ones and what do they have in mind, and is it really worth it? What's the channel? Are they making a phone call? If they're making a phone call to a lot of their portfolio companies, that's a lot of time. I would be interested. And then what's their leverage? Especially for the index-driven investments, they can't exit those investments. So what's the leverage, or is it not leverage? Is it just that they have a friendly phone call? And then finally, you did hint at this in your talk, but I think I didn't see it in the paper. PAC money is not corporate money, so it is a corporate governance concern. It's a concern. I see that this is a way of individuals amplifying their political spending. That's a political concern, but it certainly isn't a classic corporate governance concern, because it's not shareholders' money that's being spent. Those are my questions and my comments. I find the paper very interesting and very surprising.
Thank you, Mike. These were great discussion and great comments. And so maybe just like to add on to the very first point you made about this relative effect of, let's say, the magnitudes, or what's like the benchmark, let's say, of what we're comparing it to. So that's actually a test that we are hoping to do. We've been thinking about, let's say, constructing. So we have like these cost and similarity scores, and what we wanted to do is that we want to construct this like pseudo firm giving benchmark where we use the equity ownership and then use like a weighted average of, let's say, how much, let's say, influence potentially the investor is giving, multiply that by, let's say, the equity ownership, and then take the weighted average, so like the remaining, let's say, assign the remaining, let's say, percentage to the firm givings, and then see how that correlates over time, let's say, with the investor givings. So that's like something we want to do, potentially use, let's say, different, let's say, benchmarks, and then look into this relative magnitudes. Is this excess influence, or is it, let's say, just like, is this actually just like what they're supposed to do? It's because at the end of the day, this is not illegal, right? This is you would definitely know this better than us. But in terms of legality, asset management companies or owners in general can have a saying in terms of political weighings. Francesco looked into this quite a lot in terms of thinking, is there any legal implications to this? But we actually don't think that there's any breach of law or so. But this excess influence could be something interesting to look into. It could have potential legal implications too. And then in terms of who makes the decisions, that's a very good question too. So that's actually something that came up in a last call as well. And Miriam actually said that she was going to look into this even further. So it's also something that we have been thinking about. It's who makes these decisions? Is it the CEO? We have some evidence, I would say. There's a recent Journal of Financial Economics paper that finds that, let's say, CEOs have an important saying on the firm's, let's say, PAC givings. So in that aspect, CEOs could have a play in this. Bonica has some papers on this in terms of looking into CEO givings and CEOs having actually an influence. So in that aspect, it's certainly, I would say, even finding anecdotal evidence would be very helpful. So it's something on our radar, and we will be definitely adding that in the next version. And then who are these private versus public funds? That's also certainly something I think it would be nice to add more statistics on this aspect. And then I think the other comments were also really good. So it's certainly something we'll be looking into, and hopefully will be reflected in the next version. So your comments and questions are well appreciated. Thank you.
So in the US, are these political contributions, do they have to be approved by shareholders or not?
So there's not a there's the committee. There's a political action committee of the corporation or the fund itself, and that typically would make the decisions in terms of who should be deciding it. But it's not necessarily the board or so. The board sometimes, at least what we have seen, is that there are let's say specific committees of a board, or like let's say specific committees of a corporation that has a, let's say, political committee. I would say that they have a saying in this as well. They would be most likely or intuitively thinking that they would be having a saying on this. But we haven't seen much in terms of where, let's say, there's an active engagement, or at least like it shouldn't be the case. It's at least, I would say, from a legal perspective, it's actually illegal that let's say, if employees are against the fact that, let's say, we should not be supporting to a politician, and if the corporation actually dominates, or like a board or let's say a committee dominates this decision of the overall representation of the employees, that would be actually, I would say, taken out of the context. Mike would definitely know this better in terms of legality, but that's at least our understanding that it's really the representation of the employees or the managers who have, or let's say, contributed to this PAC of the corporation or the asset management company, that should be reflected on the spendings and also the redistribution of these funds to politicians.
Well, but the 2.7 million that Mike was talking about, I mean, who approved the giving of 2.7 million at AT&T? I mean, who takes that decision? The board? Is that the board, or?
It's a committee. As Eyub said, it's a committee, and the board presumably could get involved informally if it wanted to, but I don't think you'd ever find it in board minutes. I could be wrong.
I mean, from a European perspective, that sounds extraordinary. So, I mean,
but it's employee money. I mean, in a way, I think of the PAC more as like a student activity in a university. They've got this. They're providing, they've got a gym, they got a restaurant sometimes, and they got a way that the employees can do their politics or make political contributions. So it really isn't part of the corporation. It's just nearby, and therefore it's not implausible that the board, well, it's entirely plausible the board would have influence. It's where the investors have influence that I would have said, if you asked me, should I look into this? I'd say no. I would have thought it's impossible. Which actually, if are there any other questions in the queue? Because I could add one here.
Roberta wants to come in on this. Roberta, please.
Yeah, so I had a couple questions on this, but one was, it was hard to see how one director would have much of an impact. And so maybe you could talk about something about that, or maybe interact their stock ownership of their company with one director, or make some adjustment of that. How long as the director, I know you're doing when they first get their block, but it might be interesting to see what happens over time. One question I had though about the data is, there are other papers that look, I think Mark Rowe, I don't know if he's still here, has done a paper where, as we might expect, regulated firms are more involved in politics because it matters to them more. And I'm wondering, is there, if you divide your sample between regulated and not, is there a different effect, or is this like self-selection by the investment managers about which companies that they're investing in, where donations might matter more? Does an investor like Carlyle, do they seek this in all of the companies they invest in? Is there any way for you to check that in your data set? Or is it just the ones where they think contributions might affect the value of the company? Are these more profitable versus less profitable? I mean, it's hard to figure out what the investor, this is part of Mike's questions, it's hard to figure out what the investors' motivations are, why you invest in a company, then go on their board and want them to make a political contribution. Does that have any connection to like what their plans are for the company? Were they activists in particular desire about wanting them to sell a division or increase dividends? They might, to give us more flavor, since I'm not aware of like anecdotes in the newspaper about talking about investors doing this. Those are things that maybe if your data tell you something, you could tell us more about the phenomenon.
Well, that sounds great. This is all very helpful, and I would say like it's definitely something very interesting where if you look into just like a board connection of, let's say, Citadel's representation on just Apple or so, we've looked into, let's say, BlackRock sitting on the board of Apple as well. So that's actually something very striking if you just have an asset management company and then or like one shareholder sitting on the board of a portfolio firm and that having so much of an influence. That's something that we haven't really looked into the granularity in terms of, let's say, is it something, let's say, could be, let's say, the connection is very long. So they have been, let's say, sitting on the board for a much longer period relative to, let's say, the other board members. That could be an important mechanism in order to understand. Maybe this is this extended relationship or like a relationship that has been established over time. That could be an important mechanism. So we can definitely look into the length of, let's say, how long a board member or the asset management companies, let's say, representative sits on the board relative to the other board members, and then look into that as well. Or if the other, let's say, shareholders or other asset management companies, let's say, representatives sitting on the board of the given portfolio firm. So that could be something interesting, because you would think that, especially if the ideologies are very aligned, let's say 2 Republican funds or 3 Republican funds, asset management companies, let's say, representatives sit on the board of the same portfolio firm, that actually would be, I would say, a much more powerful mechanism in order to exert influence than, let's say, just having one, let's say, representative on the board. So that's something we can certainly look into. That's a great suggestion. And then in terms of looking to different industries or the heterogeneity and, let's say, the firms, that's also something we hope to do. It's we already had so many tests, and we didn't want to like dilute the paper further, but it's certainly, I would say, something important to look into in terms of what's exactly happening. And it could also help us out with the story to pin down, is this about a personal gain story or is it about financial returns? If we don't really find differences across industries, regulated versus non-regulated industries or so, or let's say different industries where political, let's say gains or political favors could actually be beneficial to the firm's returns. That's actually something I would say important to the main point of the paper as well, that this is about a personal gain story or of asset management companies. So that's certainly, I would say, it's well taken, and we'll definitely look into that.
Jeff, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I'm back. So what about the activists? So an Icahn or an Elliott or a starboard. First, they take large blocks. Second, the individuals who run these funds have decided political views often and are not shy about expressing them. Mm-hmm. And third, they often seek board seats. So it would seem to me that if your routine asset manager would have political influence, then this group ought to have it double starred. So it does seem to me it might be worth doing a specific examination of this group, who are not necessarily asset managers in the sense of your the citadels, but nevertheless, and indeed take bigger stakes, and so would have on the dimension you suggest even more influence. And because they see board seats and are directly engaging with management, that after all is their business model, would have many more channels than a passive investor who is taking a 1% block.
Well, this is awesome, Jeff. I really like the idea that you have in terms of this will be like a really nice, especially channel of understanding how this could actually be, or what could be driving the results. And it's at least I would say the prior this knowledge we have about these activists is that it's pretty obvious that they would be a lot more likely to be engaged in let's say these type of activities. So it's certainly, I would say, of first order importance to check this, and then potentially also even control for this. So the fact that it's break it down, are these the ones that drive the results, or is it let's say how much of an influence do they have compared to the other type of, let's say, non-activist investors that have also, let's say, a relatively large stake in the these corporations. So that's a great comment. I really like this. It's certainly, I would say, something we'll be tackling. Thank you.
Mike. Yeah, I just want to, I'm going to just generalize Roberta's and Jeff's question. I think you ought to look at it a little bit more broadly. The paper, in a way, I mean, I think it ends too soon. That's what we're saying. I can't say it ends where it should have begun, but I think it ought to continue. Frankly, it's implausible that this is a pervasive, generalized activity. Vanguard or even Citadel would have to hire someone who's constantly on the telephone calling and whatever. So it can't really be that. And therefore the question is, what is it? So that, I think, is I think that's the question. It could be regulated industries, it could be activists, it could be isolated to certain congressional races. I would like start with the broader question: what on earth could be driving this? Because as a general matter, it's utterly implausible.
I think that's a good point. It's
but I like it. But it's good. It's there, and it raises a good question.
I think that's a great point. It's I would say that we added like a lot of fixed effects. So let's say an importance of a specific race, or so we would be capturing those type of effects, or is it, let's say, even like firm specific let's say aspects. We have firm fixed effects or firm times cycle fixed effects. So it would be potentially capturing some of these, let's say, dimensions that we haven't really controlled for, is it a regulated industry or not, or is there something going on in terms of, let's say, the specific race or so, or a specific politician even itself, right? It could be someone who's very popular, has attracted a lot of money. There's something going on in terms of the, let's say, the driving these convergencies or so. So we tried our best in terms of looking to these very saturated fixed effects models and trying to understand what is really remaining. So we really sliced the data into multiple pieces, took out these potential other explanations, and then looked into, let's say, what remains, and that could be, let's say, this influence. But then, of course, there's a lot more we can do in terms of, let's say, breaking it even further down in terms of who are these investors? Are these activists? Are these, let's say, different type of investors? So there's certainly something I would say, as you mentioned, it's we draw like some, I would say, too early conclusions, or so we have to we're a bit rushing in terms of submitting the paper. So but it's I'm totally on the same page in terms of let's say looking to more dimensions and getting this out. But I would say my co-authors are a bit also like we.
Well, we've, it's been recorded. We've pinned there that it's there. It exists. It's utterly implausible, and we really want to know what's going on. So activists. So Jeff brought up activists. Alon wants to come in because he thinks that activists might not be the explanation for the utterly implausible. Alon, do you want to say why?
I don't have any empirical evidence, and Jeff probably has a better insight than I do. But I mean, why take sides? I mean, if you're kind of building your entire platform with change, why would you want to piss off, some party by taking a side? What do you stand to gain by getting into fights that don't help you? So I don't know, but again,
it's the scorpion.
The data.
They can't help themselves.
What is that?
They can't help themselves. That's what Jeff said. It's the story of the scorpion and the frog, remember? So, anyway, so Eyub, I think it's been a long day. So I think we'll leave it there with Mike's challenge for you. It's there. It's implausible. And, we want to hear next time you come to GCGC what it is. So I now have so first of all, of course, so Elaine reminds me, she has put more notes in the chat because she runs everything in the background, of course. And I've been given the task to try and wrap up this day, which is, of course, impossible. Now, we had early in the year organized by Luca a global marathon, 24-hour marathon going around the globe. So we are now used to operating in different time zones. In Brussels, the sun is definitely down. Today, we had a sort of half or quarter marathon, and we've now come to the close on the west coast of the United States. And we had, in fact, quite a discussion about California. And we learned that California is a bit like Norway, believe it or not. Well, it has a coastline. but at least in terms of gender diversity on boards, it's a bit like Norway. Now, there's, of course, something else that fascinates Europeans about California, which is sort of like, let me call it the Anatad Marty theme, that California is, of course, also the source of these evil corporations that are destroying cultural diversity in Europe, and which is why especially the French state, but also the European Commission, needs to spend millions of euros to protect our diversity from these evil California corporations. Now, I will do a bit of advertising for the Financial Times because they have a wonderful story this in the Weekend magazine explaining to us about a series called Capitani. Now, that's not a series from Italy, but actually from Luxembourg. And it's apparently in Luxembourgerish. If you've never listened to Luxembourgerish, it's the language that they speak in Luxembourg to distinguish themselves from the Germans, the French, and the Belgians. And this series, it so happens, thanks to California, is the #1 watched series in Argentina and Uruguay. So I think going back to the discussion we had about corporations, I think what's so fascinating and why we are here and why we have these global corporate governance colloquia is that on one hand, yes, Anat has a point. I mean, they do awful and evil things, especially if they are the right or the left hand of thuggish kings and sovereign rulers. But on the other hand, they also create great things, like actually implausibly, from California, increasing cultural diversity, including in Europe and around the world, and creating things like this interactive platform that allows us to get together. So the discussion, I think, will continue tomorrow at the hour of 8 o'clock Eastern time, whatever that might be in your time zone. And I hope that many of you will tune in again. So thank you again to Eyub and to Mike for this last passionate discussion. And we do want to find out what's going on with these contributions, because the United States looked at from the rest of the world when it comes to politics and everything to do with it is a puzzling and mesmerizing country. So thank you very much, and see you back tomorrow morning. Thank you.